In the last lesson, I talked about the mental checklists a good composer uses to evaluate and to improve their own music. In this lesson, I want to talk about the harmony checklist in particular. The next lessons will move on to the other ones. The first item in the harmony checklist was, is the overall harmonic language coherent, allowing the listener to develop expectations the composer can play with? If the harmonic language is incoherent or random, the listener won't notice any patterns. That means the listener can't foresee what's coming next. This deprives the composer of many things that contribute to a distinct musical character. While character is not only a matter of harmony, it's certainly affected by the harmony. Here's an example. The first two bars here are fairly simple, modal and triadic. But the next two bars seem to have nothing to do with them. Although in the same tempo and also played by piano, the very dissonant harmony, the constant leaps between registers, and the changes in rhythm and articulation just make them sound like the pianist is playing a completely different piece. Now, if this music were to accompany a film, and something very significant change in the storyline, perhaps the second phrase might be appropriate. But otherwise, it's just incoherent. It sounds random. And the less coherent the beginning of the piece, the harder it is for the listener to become involved. Humans normally look for patterns in what we perceive. If we don't find any, we just tend to move on. Another example. The first two bars here are the same as before, but the second phrase in bars 3 and 4 has many chromatic notes introduced very close together, as well as much stronger dissonances with lots of minor seconds. This is much less extreme than the preceding example, but still not easy to make sense of. Unless the composer finds some meaningful way to quickly bring the two harmonic styles together, again, the listener is left just perplexed. Note that for the listener, this is not a conscious analytical process. It happens automatically. When we hear the first two bars, we immediately develop certain expectations. A good composer will follow up on those expectations in a way that lets the listener get involved by having some sense of what happens next, which the composer then can play with in interesting ways. This example wouldn't be totally impossible to work out successfully, but it would take a lot of skill. A well-trained composer would follow up on the contrast between the phrases in some way, perhaps treating them like two contrasting characters in a novel. This could involve developing the contrast further, but with varying degrees of surprise, say with smoother transitions between the two phrases. But the contrast between two phrases would definitely need some kind of follow-up. Another example. The vocal line here is fairly straightforward, but the piano harmony in measure 2 and measure 3 consists of dense, very dissonant chords. Then the next two bars are either monophonic or just simple dominant seventh chords. This change of harmonic style doesn't seem to be justified by anything in particular, so it's just puzzling. The point here is not that dissonant harmony is bad or good, but that without a sense of harmonic coherence and direction, the listener can't easily sense patterns. The second item in the harmony checklist was, are there sudden holes or bumps that stick out for no good reason? An example. The second bar of the second system here starts with an accented octave, but the harmony everywhere else is fairly rich, never empty like that. If you listen attentively, that octave just sounds like a mistake, a hole in the texture. An octave in this piece isn't inconceivable, but in the middle of a phrase like this, it makes no sense. Here's an improved version. I've replaced the octave with a sixth and added another phrase at the end. The added phrase is all in octaves, and therefore it sounds like an intentional change of character, not an oversight. Here's an example of what I call a bump. Everything except the chord in measure 4 is completely diatonic. But why put a surprise in the middle of the phrase like that? If there were another surprise following it, it might be okay, but here it just sounds like an accident. Here's a better version. Here I've saved the surprise for the end. The cadence is always a special moment in the phrase, so it sounds more appropriate to place this harmonic accent there. Of course, we would expect the following music to follow up on it, but at least the change underlines the cadence here. This is an important question in harmony as well in the other dimensions of music. When something happens is often just as important as what happens. The last item in the harmony checklist is the composer using all the available resources to make the music expressive? For example, does the bass line make sense and provide a sense of direction? Is the harmonic tension well controlled and varied? Does the harmony breathe? Is the punctuation effective and appropriate to where we are in the piece? Here's an example. This phrase clearly leads to a surprise at the end, but could we make it more effective? Here's a more potent version. Here I've made the bass line into a rising scale and doubled it in octaves. Also added a crescendo. Both of these changes have the effect of preparing the surprise at the end, with the preceding progressions and dynamics in the bass line. The listener feels that the phrase is moving towards some goal. As a result, the overall effect is more potent. The next question illustrates the point that, over a whole piece, there needs to be some variety of harmonic tension. Is the harmony always totally consonant, or else always extremely dissonant, as in some 12-tone music? But it becomes monotonous for the listener then. A certain variety of harmonic tension helps the music to breathe, to develop in a more organic way. A good example is the first prelude by Chopin. This prelude starts off with simple tonic and dominant harmonies. Then at the end of the second system, the bass line starts a long rise, with various chromatic appoggiaturas in the upper parts. At the beginning of the fourth system, at the high point of the bass line, it suddenly leaps down to F sharp, then moving on to a 1-6-4-5-1 progression. The last bars are all diatonic. So overall, there's a sense of increasing intensity, then a climax and a resolution at the end. This is not a long piece, but the principle we see here is very common, since it has a rather organic feel. Tension mounts to a peak and eventually gets resolved. And this principle is visible even in much longer pieces like an opera. Just as the story needs to go somewhere, develop, and then resolve, so does the music. The resolution, even if it's on a much bigger time scale, is one of the reasons we enjoy works of art. Unlike life itself, a work of art is normally framed with a beginning, development, and a meaningful ending. It can have a kind of logic that is not subject to arbitrary change, the way life is. One may or may not agree with this philosophical point of view, but it's everywhere in evidence in works of art. Most people aren't interested in works of art that just seem to stop and start at random, with no perceptible progression in between. The last question about the appropriateness of various degrees of punctuation requires a longer example. Clear distinctions between degrees of punctuation makes larger timescales possible. Distinguishing between local punctuation and larger scale turning points help the listener to know where they are in the whole, and thus keeps the overall structure coherent. Just as a novel has phrases, sentences, paragraphs, and chapters, a large piece of music uses many different degrees of punctuation, ranging from the smallest pause to an important pivotal change in the musical narrative. If a large piece has no variety of punctuation, it becomes hard to follow over time and eventually rather monotonous. Here's an example from my cello concerto. The opening pizzicato cello solo here has some light punctuation achieved through pauses in measures 2, 5, 6, 8, and 9. Of these, the one in measure 9 is clearly the strongest. The cello reaches its highest note so far, the E flat, before the pause. The harmony here is an augmented sixth, E flat and C sharp, which needs to resolve to D, the chord on which the next section starts. As the cello starts playing arco, the orchestra comes in. This contrasting moment stands out more than the pauses within the solo cello passage, as it should, since it sets off a kind of turning point, the beginning of the dialogue between soloist and orchestra. Just for comparison, here's the same passage, but with the cello already playing arco. The orchestra's arrival is less marked. Our next lesson, we'll look at the counterpoint checklist.